the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. So today we're going to attempt to do our best to cover the topic of fat as fuel, particularly with longer duration, lower intensity types of exercises or events or expeditions or hobbies that, you have that entail that, like a multi-day backpacking, multi-day backcountry hunting, multi-day what have you. And so this question comes to us all of the time, mainly from people wanting to know if they should be taking higher fat foods on and during these events and during these training sessions, if these are indeed considered fat burning types of exercise and training. Now, what I'm going to attempt to do throughout the course of this is really create 4 questions that are most commonly given to us to help give you the information that you need to make the decision that you need to make. I'll give you kind of a forewarning. It's not really a warning, but a Spark Notes version of this ahead of time and say this. You're never using one type of fuel source, and I want to explain why that's important. The second thing is that with anything, there's going to need to be, with anything with nutrition anyway, there's going to need to be some context, background, and explanation behind it. So I'm going to try to make this as comprehensive as I can, as brief as I can at the same time, and as basic as I can. Birthed out of really there's going to be 5 questions, but 4 of them are really around endurance training and using fat as fuel. So the first question that we most commonly get is the fat that is used during low intensity, long duration exercise dietary fat that we eat, or is it stored body fat that we already have inside of us? Now, I'm going to give you a couple of different scenarios and people to think about as I answer this, and you can kind of decide where it is that you fall. So first and foremost, the primary source of fuel when you're talking about this and you're talking about using fat as fuel is going to be from stored body fat. Now, this is true for anyone who is above a weight that they like being at, down to the leanest of lean. We all are going to have some fat somewhere in us to the tune of thousands of calories, and that's going to be the first stop that our body makes to use as fuel. Now, as a part of that process of breaking down dietary fat to deliver it as fuel, it gives you individual parts that it then deposits into the muscle. And this is going to be a very bizarre but very good metaphor for what we're talking about here. If you've ever been to the grocery store or you've ever had a garden and you think about snap peas or grown pea pods in your garden come in the form of this big pod, and then within that pod is sometimes 3, sometimes 5, sometimes more individual peas themselves. If you could think of these individual peas as being these elements of fat that happen when fat breakdown happens, those peas then get deposited into your muscle. The fancy word for these are intramuscular triglycerides. Or an easy way to think of that is they are fat deposits made within inside of the muscle. These are not a bad thing. These are just the byproduct of whenever fat gets broken down, it gets deposited into use in your muscle as fuel, should you need it. So that's the secondary source that your body is generally tapping into, particularly during endurance training. Now, a very, very, very important and key thing to remember throughout this conversation is that even in long duration, low intensity exercise, the body is not using 100% fat. During low intensity, long duration exercise, the body's using about 60% of fat, whether it's from your stored tissue, whether it's from these intramuscular triglycerides, or we'll talk about dietary fat here in a minute. It is using 60%. That means somewhere there's another 40% that is fueling the effort that you are giving. And you would be correct. You probably see where this is going, that is from carbohydrates. As the intensity and as your training or as the event changes, there will be periods in which you are relying on greater intensity. And as that happens, the degree to which the intensity goes up, the reliance becomes less on fat and more on carbohydrates. So at some point, that pendulum is constantly changing from sometimes 60% reliance to 50% reliance to 40% reliance. And so you are never just relying on one source. And that's an important thing to remember. Now, that brings the natural question about which is okay, well, that sounds great, but at what point does dietary fat or fat that I'm eating in the moment come into play? The answer there would be not for a very, very, very long time. For the most part, when we eat a meal that contains a reasonable amount of fat, or maybe it's entirely fat, it's going to take somewhere between 3 and 6+ hours for your body to process that food, convert it into fuel that you're actually using, deposit it into the muscle or your storage, to then be used as actual fuel. So the series of events that happens in that sense is more like this. You eat whatever meal it is that you're thinking about that's going to provide you fuel. 6 to 8 hours later, it finally goes through the conversion process to where we are back to square one, and now the body can begin breaking it down into fuel. So if you're not already drawing the conclusion yourself, what that means is it is an extremely long process from the point that you consume a high fat meal until it even has the opportunity to be converted into fuel, which is why it's not a great idea to think that in the middle of these events, if you eat something at a specific time, that your body is going to then be tapping into that as a resource for fuel shortly after you eat it. It won't. It will take a very long time. So the sequence of orders is first it's going to use stored body fat, then it's going to use these intramuscular triglycerides or these small fat peas, if you will, inside of the muscle. And only later, much, much later, can dietary fat then be converted into fuel through the other two processes that we'd mentioned. So hopefully that at least gives you a decent explanation just off of what is the most common and most frequently asked question. That leads us into question two. Well, tell me more about this intramuscular triglyceride versus muscle glycogen. Which one's actually better? If you've listened to any prior episodes, we've talked a ton about carbohydrate fueling and how when you are fueling on carbohydrates, the body will take that carbohydrate and put it into the long stores called muscle glycogen. As you begin to train, it can rely on and pull from these stores when and as it needs it. So you have two. You have these intramuscle, these fat deposits that are inside of the muscle. Then you also have this reservoir that is inside of the liver called muscle glycogen. One's predominantly made up of carbs, one is predominantly made up of dietary fat. This is where the entire conversation of that whole 60-40 split becomes more and more relevant. So there's not one that is more superior than the other. They both work in tandem to make you a complete athlete, to make you a complete backpacker, a complete hunter. You're never in a position where you are suffering the consequences from being too low in either. And what I mean by that is this. You're for the most part, you're going to try to manage your intensity, but you're not always going to be able to. There's going to be periods where you sprint. For example, in an ultra, particularly really long ultras, as that race drags on and your heart rate drift gets more and more. In other words, it's really difficult to keep a lower heart rate and try to even make time cutoffs. You're going to increase intensity. If there is no carbohydrate or muscle glycogen there for your body to process that higher intensity, you will fall and feel flat. So in that scenario, muscle glycogen is a good idea. Your stored body fat at that stage of the game when intensity increases is going to do you no good. So to sit here and to try to say or try to be on team 100% dietary fat or team 100% dietary carbohydrate is a bit of a misnomer, and you're to some degree cutting yourself short, right? And so one of the great values of even being in zone 2, low intensity, fat reliant fuel is that it is preserving muscle glycogen so that when you need it, it is available. You're not just torching through it in an hour and having to find food every hour or every, 30 minutes or 60 minutes or however long those intervals end up being. So to try to say that one is more superior than the other would be a bit misleading. But let's talk about the features of both, right? I mean, we sort of established that both can be extremely helpful, and to be on either side with while avoiding the other side really diminishes your ability to operate at an optimal level as opposed to just functioning and making it through. So muscle glycogen is the predominant fuel source when intensity is high. I told you earlier that you're never just 100% burning body fat. There's always a mixture. That's not true with carbohydrate. When intensity climbs, particularly as it approaches that 80 to 85% of your maximum ability, your body's 100% reliant on carbohydrate as fuel to maintain that same speed and cadence, right? So it is from that standpoint much, much more efficient, particularly at higher outputs, like we're talking about with intensity. Number two, it requires a lot less oxygen to produce energy from carbohydrate. So if you're doing any of those things, your body literally cannot process fat fast enough. I've talked earlier about how that conversion takes hours as opposed to seconds with some carbohydrates. So it also depends on what you're doing from an efficiency standpoint. The negative side of it, though, is that capacity is limited. You can only store, 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate in any given time. So that's why when you're talking about carb intake, you're always trying to refuel that. And if you have the opportunity to do that because you have aid stations, because you got a backpack, because whatever, it still can be and is, in my opinion, the preferable fuel source because of everything that we are mentioning here. Now, on the flip side of that, the storage form of fuel inside of the muscle from dietary fat can be helpful at lower outputs because you're just burning through it much slower. Now, something to pay attention to and or something to think of is, like I said earlier, by relying on that, it allows you to preserve the glycogen so that when you come up to these more steeper approaches, etc., that you've got the fuel there and you don't end up actually falling flat on your face. And so when you ask the question of is one of them more superior than the other, the answer is no. They are they are to some degree, they work in tandem. They are a team, right? And so to be only on one side of that while avoiding the other significantly reduces your ability to feel what it feels like to operate at an optimal level. Leads us to question 3. If we can use fat in the muscle as fuel and it's more effective at lower intensities, why should I even care about stored carbohydrate since carbohydrates are not used as heavily at lower intensities? So we, to some degree, sort of pointed that out in the previous question. But one thing that we didn't say is that to convert stored body fat to fuel or to make it operate like it does in the muscle, it needs assistance. It needs helper. That entire process happens, but it happens at a relatively slow rate, and it needs the assistance of something else to make it happen efficiently. The irony is that the byproduct of the thing that it needs help from comes from carbohydrate metabolism. So if you completely avoid carbohydrates, this assister, this helper, this aid that converts fat into fuel so you can actually use it in the muscle is available in less degree. To me, what I remember this as would be like a no call, no show when I worked at Arby's in high school. And what that means is like if you had 6 people scheduled for an evening dinner shift, it should work pretty well. You can move everybody through and it doesn't seem like you're getting so slammed. But if you get 3 people for one reason or another who don't call, they don't tell you they're coming in, you can't get backup and they don't show, then it's very, very, very inefficient and it makes everybody wait and it makes everything seem chaotic. And in a lot of ways, this is the same. If you completely remove the very thing that helps the efficiency of converting fat into fuel, it's going to be less efficient. It's not going to happen to the same degree or to the same rate that it's designed to. And so, you know, the phrase that you will often hear about thrown around in this, in this world about this very thing as far as converting fat into fuel without carbohydrates is fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. And that is because the very nature of processing carbohydrate produces this, let's call it, we'll call it a substance, produces this substance that aids in the conversion of fat into fuel. If that is not there, it doesn't happen as efficiently, which means that you don't get that conversion to be happening at the rate that you want. You don't operate as well. And if you don't operate as well, your perception of how you are doing and how things are going and your performance is in decline. And so, what does that mean? You said, and the question is, well, if fats is so great in the muscle whenever it's lower intensities, why should I even care about carbohydrate? And the answer there is because carbohydrate helps that process when you need it to happen more efficiently. So, again, this is not about being anti carbohydrate or pro fat or pro carbohydrate, anti fat. It is the general message of the mixture and the teamwork of the two create the best version of you to make sure that no matter what intensity you're at, you're going to be able to thrive in it. Right. And then there is this sort of final thought as well about the ability of carbohydrate to make you just mentally think clear. As you begin to run out of fuel, the brain operates predominantly and preferably on glucose. If there is no carbohydrate on board to operate that brain and think clearly with, it'll start to show up, right? And so again, the entire conversation is really a system. It's not focused on one particular topic, meaning the presence of carbohydrate the presence of having some fat to fuel from, whether that's fat that you're eating to be used later or just stored body fat in general, then helps you preserve the actual carbohydrate so that if intensity does increase, when it does increase, you're both able to think clear and still operate really, really well after multiple days of already being on the trail, being in the backcountry, or doing an ultra or whatever it is that you're doing. So they work in tandem with each other. It's not about one or the other. It's really just creating this entire idea of a whole system. So that then goes to question number 5, which is a little bit unrelated to this, but often gets asked in follow-up, which is, well, all of this is great, but what about for fat loss? What if I want to target losing stored body fat? How do I do that? Do I go low carbohydrate so that then my body just prefers fat and I lose more weight, or how does it work? And the answer here is much more simple. No, it's calorie deficit. But the interesting thing about this is, and why I loop this in with this whole conversation, is all of those little conversions that I just talked about taking place, whether it's in the liver or it's in the muscle or it's in stored body fat or any of those things. When you are in a deficit, your body is constantly undergoing those conversions to where it begins to, no matter what you're consuming, tap into stored body fat. If there is not enough fuel to keep you at the weight that you were at when you started whatever journey you were on, it has no option but to use what is in the storage form. So it will use up stored muscle glycogen. It can use up stored body fat. But if you are in a deficit and it exhausts most of those stores, the body has no choice but to begin to go into the stored body fat, and you begin to drop weight regardless of what the composition of your diet is. Meaning, doesn't matter if you're low carb, doesn't matter if you're low fat, doesn't matter if you're high fat and low carb. It doesn't really matter. If there's insufficient total calories from there, it's going to go into the stores and begin to try to keep you alive through that, and it has no choice but to drop the weight. So whether what you eat has no real, as long as it's in a deficit, has no real predictor of, um, has no real choice but to tap into stored body fat. So I hope that that gives you a semi-clear picture on how it all works, but let's summarize it like this. The body is going to use stored body fat in low intensity, long duration exercise. Doesn't matter if it's a multi-day event, a single ultra, or whatever. It's going to first use stored body fat. It can use the fat that you eat, but it's going to take a long process from when you eat it to create it from a stored form and then go back and use it again. So it is predominantly, no matter how lean you are, using stored body fat. You have the ability for your body to use stores inside of the muscle as well, but remember that it's always swinging between different stores, or it's always swinging between different types of macros from carbohydrates or dietary fat based on the intensity of whatever it is that you are doing. So having a mixture of those things gives you the best opportunity to operate at the highest level, regardless of where you find yourself. If you have any questions about anything that I'd said, please send them over to me. I'd be happy to answer them, happy to run through it with you or answer any questions that you've got. But thank you for listening. We'll be back again with some more new episodes throughout the rest of the month. Thanks again for checking out the episode. Like I said, if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I would be glad to help. Figuring that I would have questions if I were listening through some of the more confusing aspects of this, we decided to go ahead and put this into a guide and cheat sheet, which you can download for free in the show notes. My only ask is that if this is helpful for you, that you would share it with a friend, or you take a couple of minutes to go leave a comment, because that genuinely does help us, as well as you sending some of our free resources out to your friends whenever you find them helpful. Thanks again for checking the podcast out for the past number of years. We will be back again with many, many, many more throughout the rest of the year. Have a great week, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.